ICJ is an organisation of lawyers who are interested in the preservation of the rule of law, the right to a fair trial, procedural fairness, presumption of innocence, and all of the things embodied in the rule of law. Quite by happenstance, I became what I think is effectively the last external observer on the Jaffna Peninsula before the wheels fell off later that month and in the following month, and the last person to interview some of the people who I spoke to across both the racial, legal and political spectrum while I was in Sri Lanka. I wrote a 90-odd page report about what I saw when I got back. I travelled to Jaffna by train and went across the isthmus at Elephant Pass that divides the Jaffna Peninsula from the main part of the island, and I saw how, at least at that time, how heavily occupied that comparatively narrow strip of land was by the Sri Lankan army and the military presence that in effect cut off Jaffna from the rest of the island. It seemed to me that doing things like visiting the market in Vavunya, which I did shortly after it had been attacked and burnt, or visiting the children's home that had been attacked and burnt by members of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces. And I use the term army in a generic sense because I think the attack on the children's home was undertaken by members of the Sri Lankan Air Force, but part of the armed forces in any event. They were quite undisciplined, and it seemed to me that the leadership of the army did not want to or were unable to control those people who are at the bottom of the chain of command. I was taken to speak with a man in his home in the rural areas, the Jaffna Peninsula. He was, as I remember, he was what I would describe as a humble person. He was a local postman. He had been driving or riding his bicycle to a local shop with a billy can to collect milk to take home to his family. As he had been doing that activity, there had been a bomb attack by the Tigers on some army facility nearby, and he was arrested as a suspect to be held in case he was complicit in that activity. He was held by the army for over a year without trial, without charge, without lawyers, and I was seeing him after he had been let out, just told to go away and be a good chap and not have anything to do with those who were agitating or fighting against the government in Colombo. But he had been tortured while he was there, and he described to me, and I wrote about things that he had experienced and which his fellow Tamil inmates in army custody had experienced, and that included, at least in his case, they would drag him round a room by a wire tied round his testicles, and others had sacks put over their head, hung upside down, and powdered chili introduced into the sack while they were pushed backwards and forwards like pendulums, or others who were sleep deprived with bags over their heads and not given food and water for long periods of time. I found it, as somebody from a peaceful country such as Australia, quite confronting to hear what he had experienced. But when I came to understand the fact that some parts of the majoritarian community, almost akin to the way that parts of the German community treated Jews in the Second World War, the part of the Sinhalese community had the same reaction to parts of the Tamil community or to Tamils in general. It was something I could not comprehend, and indeed still can't comprehend. And it's certainly, I have found it a great shame over the years reading the media reports about what happened in the Civil War and the predations on both Tamil and Sinhalese communities that resulted, that it was a pity that a proper federalist system had not been established earlier. Enthusiasm and bloodthirstiness of the Tigers might not have reached the heights that it did, and the number of recruits that it obtained, had there been a more conciliatory attitude, not only when I was there, but for years before I was there. I came to look at the at the issues, particularly read the statutes and some of the things that had been enacted by the Sri Lankan Parliament or imposed by regulation of the government, abandonment of inquests on people who had died in custody, for example, so that in some instances people were dying in custody, particularly of the army, in circumstances where their bodies were disposed of and not released to their families, so that the families had no understanding of what had happened or how it had happened, or sometimes even where it had happened. There were at least part of the political class, but I'm not suggesting completely representative of the political class, who were prepared to step outside what I would consider the conventional bounds of civilised society, and certainly some of the legislation like the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which permitted people being held in custody for, from memory, up to 18 months without charge or trial. The fact that when lawyers endeavoured to take action under the habeas corpus provisions to try and get access to the people who'd been detained in custody, there was significant impediments placed in their path to get access. It was being quite capriciously applied. Second, it was being quite selectively applied primarily to members of the Tamil minority, but not exclusively. Third, that some of the provisions that enabled detention without trial for, I think it was up to 18 months, meant that people were taken out of their community and they were moved round. And it is my recollection that the majority of them, it was some hundreds of people as I recall, they were primarily in army custody rather than in police custody, that they could be moved from place to place without their relatives, or to the extent that they had lawyers, their lawyers knowing where they were. And as I recollect, the position was very early on that when applications for habeas corpus, that is for access to the people, produce the body is what habeas corpus means, that the orders that were being made by the courts were quite specific. They would say that X was to be produced to his or her lawyers at a particular nominated place, and when the lawyers would turn up at that nominated detention place, whether it was an army barracks or a prison or wherever it was, the authorities would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, they're not there, we moved them yesterday." And it wasn't until some little time later, I read, I can't remember how long later, that the courts would start making the orders in general terms rather than in specifically nominated geographic terms, which improved the system a little but not an enormous amount. But it was just the stepping outside what I call the rule of law norms that was involved by that Prevention of Terrorism Act that was, I suppose, the primary fracturing of civil society in that regard at that time. Reading the provisions of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, I think it was Section 5, and reading the inquest regulations and the like, it just struck me that the system had been damaged as well as the society being damaged. There were demonstrations against some judges of the Supreme Court who had made a decision that was unfavourable to the government, and that had resulted in demonstrations against those judges. Now, that is something which would ordinarily be regarded as alien in the Australian legal system. Now, people might hold up placards, but you wouldn't get a government bussing people round to demonstrate outside the private homes of judges, and that's what happened. I visited the ruins of the Jaffna Library. It was in the process of reconstruction. I visited the Vivunya Market, and I visited the children's facility that had been burnt down. But at that stage, it was before the fire was really truly lit, if I could say that, so that there wasn't all that much damage to see. It was the system that was damaged. It was the rule of law that was damaged. It was something that created what I would describe as a systemic climate within which the society was not protecting everybody that was part of that society. And it was that, it struck me later reading about the Civil War, it was that created a more fertile space within which something like the Civil War could happen. For those who remember what I wrote 40 years ago, it's been suggested to me that it's inadvisable that I should return to Sri Lanka. No, I don't know whether that's the case or not, but memories are long, is what I think I would say, and healing will be hard.